You may love them, but you hate what is destroying them. In fact, you hate it enough that if you could, you would destroy that part of evil right out of their life. And that's really what God is saying to his people here. He's saying, I love you, but if you introduce evil, then my holiness and my righteousness will consume that evil. It will destroy you. Now, that presents a problem, doesn't it? How can God be faithful to his people if his people are going to be unfaithful to him? Right? If God wants his people to remain faithful to him, and his people are by nature unfaithful, then how can God exist in relationship with him? How can God's people show the faithfulness that God desires? Well, there's a sense in which God cannot, or no one for that matter, can really just command someone, hey, be faithful to me. You can't command someone to have a certain affection of the heart. You understand what I mean? You can't just say, hey, you, be faithful. Have that kind of love and loyalty to me. But that's not even how God operates. If you look at what he does, especially in verse 17, what do the people do? They rehearse what God has done for them first. Look at verse 17. They say, in verse 17, it was the Lord who brought us and our fathers out of Egypt, performed those great signs and wonders, who protected us on the journey through the land which we traveled. The Lord drove out from before us the nations. See what the people are recognizing. They're going through how God has already shown his love for them. The people are reminding themselves, and they often do this in the Old Testament especially. They rehearse God's mighty acts. In other words, they're saying, God has been faithful to us. And our response is to be faithful to him. In the Old Testament, the people started off strong. They were committed at first, but eventually Joshua was right and they fell away. They weren't able to be faithful. They forgot what the Lord had done. And so then the question is, well, what is it going to cost God to continue to be faithful to his spouse? What will it cost God to remain committed to his bride here? How can God be committed without destroying them? And the answer comes to us in the person of Jesus. Because it's in Jesus that God destroys the evil of his people without destroying his people themselves. Right? It's in Jesus that the sins of his people are placed. Right? They're placed upon Jesus. And Jesus is hung up on the cross. And there, God's anger against sin is demonstrated, and it's poured out on Jesus. And it's in Jesus that God destroys our sin, your sin and mine. And what that means for us is that if we want to be faithful, if we desire to be faithful to God, what do we need to do? We need to simply look back at the cross and say, look at what it cost God to be faithful to us. Look at the way God shows his love and his loyalty to you and to me.